ONIMU from London.
Thank you, Pamela and Simon. Great to be here.
Ian, you seem like a mild-mannered fellow from the little bit that I know you.
How dare you?
Are you, what drew you to this book and this topic? Do you enjoy conflict? Do you like going into the fray? Was this a kind of Trump era project because of all the political conflict?
No, I wouldn't say I'm very combative. In fact, I'd say I'm quite conflict averse. And yeah, I think I started thinking about this properly around 2016, in the wake of the Brexit referendum campaign over here and the Trump ascendancy, and just looking around at all the terrible arguments that were happening all the time, seemingly, and all the kind of the toxicity of it and the futility of these arguments that didn't seem to kind of shed any light.
They didn't go anywhere. They weren't productive. They
didn't
weren't
go
good
anywhere.
arguments.
They didn't produce anything. They were just bad arguments, right? So it seemed kind of a pointless waste of energy. But then so that was kind of what alerted me to this. I started thinking, why are we so bad at this? Why can't we argue better? And then as I thought about it more and I researched it more and I started kind of talking to experts and so on, I thought a couple of things. One is that the problem is much sort of deeper and more historically rooted than just, it's not just about Twitter, right? Which a lot of people think it is. It's not just about the internet. That's a part of it, and I'm sure we'll cover it. But it's due to some sort of deep historical trends. We're living in a much more brilliantly diverse and egalitarian society where everybody has a voice, right? We're a much less traditional, less hierarchical society than we used to be. I mean, and all societies are, right, to lesser or greater degrees than they used to be. But nobody's trained us in how to disagree.
It's not something you learn in school necessarily. It's not something your parents transmit to you.
Nobody, and it's just not seen as you're just expected to be able to do it. And it's a really hard thing to do because it involves other people and tense conversations and kind of all sorts of issues to do with relationships. It's never just about the thing that you're meant to be disagreeing about, right? So it's really hard to do, but nobody trains you how to do it. And I also came to think that the problem is not all the toxic arguments. I mean, that is a problem. The problem is because we see all these toxic arguments, we therefore avoid it as much as possible. The biggest problem is kind of the invisible one of all the arguments and disagreements that are avoided. So really the mission of the book came to be, can we find a way to make disagreement less stressful, to make people, reduce the chances of people recoiling from it in horror, actually get into it and feel more confident about it. Because actually, if you give people a set of tools and a set of skills and a way of thinking about it, you can actually unlock the immense benefits that come from good disagreement.
That's right. And so in your book, you go through many examples of people who were able to have productive disagreements. And one example, which was a very surprising one for me, was the Wright brothers, who invented the airplane. And apparently their father encouraged them to argue constantly with each other in order to come up with better ideas, and it encouraged them to keep changing sides, like you would in a debate tournament where you don't know if you're arguing for or against the death penalty. You have to be able to do both. Why was that a useful way of arguing?
Yeah, exactly. So he would, at the dinner table, would say, "Okay, here's an issue of the day. Now, Edgar, you take this side, and you take the other side, and then you swap round and you argue the other case after half an hour, right?" And so the two brothers just got into this habit of arguing. They just came to see it as part of the normal kind of flow of the relationship. And it meant that they were just very skilled at interrogating each other's and their own thinking on absolutely everything.
And they weren't afraid of looking ridiculous. I think that they kind of trusted each other not to humiliate the other.
Yeah, exactly. They weren't afraid of looking ridiculous, and they weren't afraid that it was going to damage the relationship, which is, the two of the things that put us off disagreeing with other people. We think, oh, this is going to harm our relationship, or I'm going to end up looking silly. They didn't care about any of that. It was what they did, right? And it played a huge role in them getting to the answers quicker than anyone else. Because actually, you think about it, I hadn't, we all know that the Wright brothers invented the first aeroplane, manned flight, but until you really think about it, you sort of underrate how phenomenal it was that these two guys with no qualifications, with no attachment to an institution or a corporation, these two guys who run a bike shop in Dayton, Ohio, were the first people to crack a problem that everyone else was,
I
lots
thought
of
they were in
experts
Kitty
were.
Hawk, North Carolina. Not that that's what we're talking about.
Pardon?
I thought they were in North Carolina for some reason, but
They were
they were in
from
Ohio.
Dayton,
Okay,
Ohio. They
I'm gonna
ran a
Google
bike
it.
shop. If you walked past, people that walked past the bike shop would hear them shouting at each other, on a regular basis. And if you were near them or you spent time with them, it was often quite unnerving to see them kind of really having it out with each other, because you assumed that they hated each other, but that wasn't the case. Actually, they were incredibly close, and the balance that they struck was they were very vigorous in attacking each other's arguments, but they also listened to each other incredibly intently at the same time, and that was the kind of the magical, the alchemy that enabled them to make these great leaps forward much faster than their peers.
One thing that you mentioned in your book is we put so much emphasis in sort of corporate culture and maybe even academic culture on brainstorming. But you say actually brainstorming is not that productive, and debate where you kind of knock down someone's ideas is much more a much more productive way of getting the best ideas to rise. Why is that?
Yeah, because in a debate, when a debate works well, right, and we can talk about the reasons that this doesn't work, but when a debate works well, you've got a group of people, literally or figuratively, around a table. They all have a point of view and a particular perspective, and they make their best case for it, and they try and knock out the weak arguments on the other side, right? So when it works well, it's like a kind of process of natural selection where the strongest arguments survive, and you're also, because you want to make your argument, you're motivated. You think harder about your own argument, right? So you think of all the reasons you might be right. So everyone's kind of throwing out all these reasons. They're drawing on all the evidence they can. Everything gets thrown into the debate, and if in a good discussion the bad arguments or the weak evidence is kind of sifted away, and you end up with a strong point of view. Now that doesn't happen unless people are actually openly disagreeing, right? And what happens often in a brainstorm or in any corporate context where people feel a great emphasis, now more than ever, I think, to get along. Like there's a huge emphasis put on being cooperative team player, right? For good reason. But I think we've kind of underweighted the importance of encouraging people to speak up and disagree. And so on the one hand, we're talking a lot about diversity, which again is fantastic and important. But if you have a group of people sitting around a table from diverse backgrounds with diverse perspectives, and they all just nod along with each other because they all want to be nice, you're not really unlocking the benefits of that diversity. So I think that you need disagreement and conflict to do that.
Another interesting thing that you say in your book is, everyone, when they're sort of poised to disagree, not everyone, but most people feel this kind of pain in their body where they want to walk away from it. And you said you have to sort of get used to that feeling and understand that feeling is natural, and kind of just sit with it and go forward into the conversation.
Yeah, and you saw that with the Wright brothers. People were very uncomfortable with it, and then they realized that actually you can become okay with it. But maybe the best analogy is with exercise. Exercise is something we do when we're doing it. We feel uncomfortable. Sometimes it's really horrible, actually, but we do it because we know that we're becoming stronger in the process. And the same thing is happening in a disagreement. It can be quite uncomfortable to do, but actually your thinking is being strengthened. And as I talk about, extensively, your relationship is being strengthened as well. So counterintuitively, it's actually disagreement and argument that brings people together. And when you avoid that altogether, people are more likely to kind of drift apart.
And it's a great analogy exercise, because obviously it gets easier as you keep doing it and you become more skilled in it. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the tricks that not tricks, but skills that you list in your book about how to become better at arguing. And I thought we could talk about it in the context of a subject that's very topical at this moment, which is vaccines. And, I live in a country where 40% of people don't want to get vaccinated. They're skeptical about it. And it's very hard to have conversations about it. And in your last newsletter, you talked about a conversation between a doctor who was sitting in a kind of cafe. And what do they call cafes in America again? Diners. Sitting at a diner.
Yeah.
Yeah. And talking to a waitress who was skeptical about getting vaccines. And in the course of the conversation, the doctor says she convinced the waitress that vaccines were a good idea. What happened in this interaction and what went right? What did the doctor do correctly to convince the waitress?
Yeah, it was really interesting because she kind of asked her about the vaccine, and the waitress indicated that she wasn't going to take one, or at least she was wary about the idea. And the doctor did not immediately go in and say, well, you need to do that because it's good for your health and it's good for everyone around you. You should take the vaccine. She just kind of backed off a little bit in the conversation, spent a little bit of time kind of just establishing a connection. You know,
Literally just talking about the weather. Just
exactly, literally talking about the weather.
Yeah.
Cold out here, you're putting the tables out. Anyways, good to see you again. I haven't seen you for a while. And then she asked her what she thought. She said, so tell me more about you know, what's going on, how you feel about it. And the waitress said, look, I feel like I'm in the middle of a tug of war. On the one hand, I've got people like you, frankly, telling me you're stupid if you don't take this vaccine. On the other hand, I'm getting loads of messages from people I know from social media saying this vaccine is dangerous, stay away with it. And I'm kind of stuck in the middle. And you know, the worst thing is just the pressure from both sides, and it just makes me kind of want to back away from it altogether. And the doctor again did not succumb to the temptation that I think people, you know, experts often feel, which is to start lecturing her at this point and say, you know, ignore those stupid videos, listen to people like me. She just said, she actually asked the lady for advice. She said, well, how do you think we should, how should we talk about it? How should we handle it? And the lady said, well, look, just do what you're doing, which is just give me some space, you know, ease up, let me think. And she sort of indicated that she was coming around to the idea, but her basic point was, you know, don't try and make me do this. I thought it was a fascinating example. Yeah, it's fascinating in its own right, but it also reminded me of a lot of the conversation I'd had with expert or practitioners of tough conversations in my book. So when I talked to interrogators who interrogate terrorists, and talked to hostage negotiators, the really good ones do a similar thing to what that doctor was doing, kind of intuitively. Yeah. They don't go into the conversation and try and persuade the other person to do, you know, what they want them to do. So they don't get to the disagreement or the tough bit of the conversation too quickly. First of all, they establish a connection, just like
right. So they say slow it. So one principle that you have is you just slow down the conversation. You don't go straight into the
so I think one of the big mistakes. So one of the big mistakes I think we make in all sorts of contexts is we get to the disagreement too fast before we've established that, before we've kind of leveled the ground on which we're standing. And so interrogators.
Another, just to clarify where the steps you're taking us through here. A second point is that before you go into the agreement, you use that beginning slow time to establish a personal connection with the person you're talking to.
Yes.
Your kind of shared humanity, the things you might have in common.
Exactly. So what you're trying to do is establish we have more in common than just this thing that we are disagreeing on. You know, if the disagreement becomes only about the disagreement itself and everyone's just focused on that, actually it's probably going to go wrong. You need to establish some wider bandwidth connection with the person and then get to the thing, right? And then that person will feel more secure and more relaxed in actually getting into the substance of the disagreement. They're not worrying anymore, or they're not worrying so much about this relationship. Is this person giving me enough respect? Do they like me? Are they trying to trick me? All that stuff goes away and they can just think about the thing that we're meant to be talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ian, because I often find in these kind of disputes or disagreements that I'm pandering to the other person, or I'm sort of like pretending to be nice in order to establish a relationship so that they'll change their mind. But one thing that you said in your book, which I found really interesting, is you should force yourself to genuinely like the other person. And then if you don't do that, it'll sort of read as artificial.
the absolute golden rule of all of this. I mean, I have 10 rules of productive argument in the book, right? But if they turn into tricks or just, you know, glib techniques, and you don't practice them sincerely, then that they will backfire. Actually, the 10th rule is be real, right? None of this works unless you actually do it authentically. So interrogators, when they are genuinely curious about the suspect, right? So they come into the room, they do not say, well, the expert ones do, you know, there's lots of bad interrogators, but the good ones do not walk into the room and say to the terrorist, right, you need to tell me what you know. Otherwise, you know, we're going to throw the book at you, whatever it is, because that is absolutely guaranteed to shut them down. It's actually just like handing them armor. It's, you know, it's a psychological defense mechanism goes into gear, right? What they do is the opposite. They go into the room and they say, well, I'm just really interested in why you're here, how it happened. I just want to hear your story. Tell me. And these hardened terrorists who've been trained, you know, to resist interrogation, just sort of open up, and you know, 9 times out of 10, they gush not just their story, but a lot of important information too. When you try and basically, you know, persuade someone to do something, get something to do something that you want them to do, people feel like they're being pushed around, and we just have this innate and powerful aversion to any form of domination, even subtle and polite domination. And when that happens, we will push back, and if that involves being irrational or aggressive or hostile, we'll do whatever it takes.
You call this principle like letting go of the rope. So you've made your argument. The person seems like they may kind of fall over to your side, but instead of just grabbing them and pulling them over, you kind of let go and let them decide on their own if they're gonna
exactly
come to you or not.
And that phrase came from one of the interrogation experts I talked to. He said, you know, most tough conversations like this go wrong because they turn into these tug of wars, right? Remember that the waitress in the conversation we talked about actually said, I feel like I'm in the middle of a tug of war. And Lawrence, the interrogation expert, said to me, and my advice always to these guys is just let go of the rope. When that happens, when you feel yourself getting into one of those kind of power struggles, those dominance struggles, just let go of the rope. And what he meant was, you know, don't keep pressing your case. Just step back from it a little and just show that you're listening and show that you're interested in them, and allow the conversation to evolve.
I'm going to play a conversation now that you suggested to me between the sort of, I don't know if you call him a philosopher, pop philosopher, Jordan Peterson, and a woman who's a feminist journalist who's interviewed. Okay, you kind of get the idea of their conversation. What's your analysis of that? We should say that she's a friend of yours, the journalist who's interviewed.
Yeah. I thought it was a fascinating conversation. I had it a couple of years ago. Look, one of the big things that I talk about in the book, but probably most of you will be familiar with this, is that one of the reasons that disagreements go wrong is that we find it hard to separate an attack on our opinion or our idea or our position from an attack on us personally, right? So when someone disagrees with us, it feels like, oh, you don't like me, or you think I'm rubbish, do you? And we're constantly you should try and separate those two things in your own mind. You should also try and help the other person separate them in their mind, right? There are the ways you can do that, which we'll get onto.
Was she doing that in this conversation? Was she reassuring him enough?
Probably not. I'm not here to say, Helen was brilliant and Jordan was terrible. But what I do think about that is that, a couple of things throughout the interview. Jordan Peterson seemed to take every one of her points as a personal attack on him. He was truculent, he was belligerent, he was sort of sulky, in a totally unjustified way, because she was one of the few journalists who had actually read his book and was familiar with his ideas, right? So this was not a kind of a hit job, whatever.
But he kept sticking to his talking points. He seemed to be like barricaded behind things he said a million times before.
He was incredibly defensive, right? And when you're dealing with somebody who's just very defensive like that and seems to interpret everything you say as hostile, which is what he was doing, you have a really tough job as an interviewer. But you know, whether or not you're the interviewer, as the person on the other side, right? And it's an interesting thing to watch at full length, because you can see Helen trying to deal with that and trying to get around his defenses. And one of the things that she quite often did in that interview, because you know, is be funny, is to use a sense of humor, right? You can see even that she was being very direct in that conversation, but you can see that she was doing it in a good humored way. She had a smile on her face, and you'll see as you watch the rest of the interview, she does more of that, and he didn't respond to it at all. There were 0 points at which he just cracks a grin or laughs or you know, just relaxes a little bit. And it's interesting because to me, I think humor is actually one of the most important ingredients of a good disagreement. It's one of the ways in which you can prevent it from turning into a power struggle. It kind of lowers people's defenses, because when you're both laughing at something, it's a reminder, it's actually literally a physical reminder that you have more in common than the disagreement itself, right? We both find life quite funny. Isn't that good? Okay, let's get back to the disagreement.
One of the funny stories you tell in your book, and which maybe you could tell us now, is about the Beatles and how they dealt with, they were in a recording studio dealing with a new manager.
Well, yeah, so still on our theme, which is humor and teasing. You know, teasing is a great form of social connection. I think it's a great kind of feedback mechanism, and the Beatles were fantastic at teasing each other and teasing others. And there is a famous story about them, which I just think is a really interesting one. Turning up to they were auditioning with George Martin at Abbey Road Studios. They'd already failed, or not far, Decca had rejected them. Now they're turning up to EMI. This is pretty much their last shot at a big London recording contract. And I think they'd failed this audition. That may well have been, you know, would never have heard of the Beatles. So they do their audition. George Martin, this very urbane, rather upper class English chap, is there, and you've got these 4 working class Liverpudlians playing rock and roll. They do they run through 10 songs. And it goes reasonably well. And at the end of the session, it's quite late at night now, George Martin invites them up to his control room, right? So it's like being called up to see the headmaster. And he asked them to sit down, and then he talks at them for 20 minutes, you know, telling them what they need to do if they really need to, you know, go that extra mile and become successful. And then at the end of it, he says, well, look, I've been talking for a while now. Is there anything that you want to tell me? Is there anything you don't like? And there's a beat silence, and the youngest member of the band, George Harrison, says, well, for a start, I don't like your tie. It's a fraction of a second silence, and then everyone breaks out laughing, including George Martin, thankfully, right? And from then on, the relationship goes from strength to strength, right? They become very...
It's a status leveler, too. It's like saying, you can't talk down to us because we've got your number, too.
I think it's a really interesting way to do that in a good humored way, to say, yeah, actually, I'm going to equalize the relationship here. Without being hostile or aggressive. I'm just going to take you down a notch in a very nice, polite way, actually, but in a funny way, because I'm going to make us all laugh. He was in a way, he was auditioning George Martin. He was kind of probing, you know, is this a guy that we're going to be able to work with? Yeah. Because if he can't take a joke, he's not going to get on with us, right? And there's all sorts of class things going on here as well. We could analyze this sociologically in all sorts of ways, but I just think it's an interesting example of how humor can kind of unlock some of those like tricky tensions in a relationship, and it's often a good way to help a disagreement or, you know, conflict-ridden conversation go better. Introduce some sort of note of humor or irony into the conversation,
and it also sort of breaks the rules a little bit. It breaks the atmosphere. It breaks the tension. It puts you on a different footing with people. Introduces a surprising element.
Yes, and one of the rules of productive argument is in the book is disrupt the script. So when you, and this is particularly useful when you really feel like you're stuck in the same old pattern of argument, maybe the same argument has been going on a long time, or you're having the same argument again that you've been had a lot of times, and you just, you've been in those arguments where you know what the other guy's going to say next, and you know what you're going to say in response, and it's just like, and any way you can disrupt the script, which I mean, introduce surprise, variety in what you say, but also how you say it. And that might be humor, might be a change of tone. It might be just being extraordinarily nice to them.
Shockingly nice.
Yeah,
right.
It might be shockingly nice. It might be agreeing with them on something that they didn't expect you to agree with. But just kind of like getting people out of their script, getting you out of a rut is an important way to kind of, generate a bit of variety and surprise in the conversation.
While we're on the topic of rock bands, you looked at a few rock bands in your book, and you found that actually there's an optimal level of argument within a small group like that, a creative endeavor. Because bands, though, that don't argue at all their music becomes really boring. But bands who argue too much just unravel and they break apart. What's the sweet spot there?
Yeah.
And does this apply to families as well and other situations?
Yeah. So it was actually it was remarked by a business person who said most relationships in startups fail either because they become too tense to carry on, or they're not tense enough to be productive. There needs to be some tension and some level of conflict in a startup, and actually in any group. Yeah. Including rock groups. So I just think rock groups are a fantastic kind of little laboratory for studying conflict and relationships, because they are like a little microcosm of an organization or a business or indeed a society. You've got this group of people who are all talented in different ways. They all have their different specialisms, and they're particularly in rock groups, they're kind of all quite headstrong usually, and they all have to come together and try and create something that's greater than the sum of their parts. And a rock critic that I spoke to, a guy called Warren Zanes, who used to be in a band himself and has basically been around or in bands for 30, 40 years, said to me something which kind of set me off down this line of thinking. He said, the bands that stay together and are successful, I've noticed over the years, are not the ones who high-five each other after gigs. They're not the ones who go around kind of hugging each other saying, hey man, you were great. They're the ones who are very honest with each other about what's going right and what's going wrong, and who all respect each other's specialisms, but are actually very happy to kind of disagree and argue. And different bands do it in different ways. So the Rolling Stones, really quite vociferous and quite happy to kind of like get into it. And indeed, I tell a story in the book where they, actually physically have a fight, which I'm not recommending, but that was their kind of they kind of had an open kind of conflict, sometimes quite heated. Other bands like REM, stayed together for a long time, very successful, were operated almost consciously like a kind of little democracy, where every issue they would sit around a table, they would talk it through, and everyone would have a point of view, and every person in the band had a veto. So if one person in the band didn't like that decision, they wouldn't do it.
One thing that you say is really lethal for a band, and probably for any small group like that, is to have disputes that are really about the status of individual members. If that's what's really going on, is like who's more powerful and who's more important and who should be in the limelight, then that's kind of a... Would you apply that also to other kinds of relationships?
Yes, absolutely. So the fundamental model right here is in any kind of disagreement, in any conversation actually, there are kind of two levels of communication, two channels of communication open at once, right? There is the thing that we're talking to. So psychologists will call this the content level of the conversation. And then there is how we feel about each other, where we're communicating about that all the time. That's the relationship level. So you've got the content related, and you've got this subterranean level called the relationship level, which is unarticulated, but it comes across in everything how we behave, the tone of our voice, the words we use. And unless that relationship level is settled, and unless there's some agreement there, it tends to knock the content level to pieces. And when you've got like egos involved and everybody's quite insecure about their own position, which is often the case in rock bands, right? You've got these kind of crazy, slightly insecure, very arrogant and very kind of insecure people at the same time. You often find that that relationship level is very unstable, and then they need to find a way to make that work before they can really get into the musical conversation or the business conversation that they're having. And yeah, that's true of any context. So organizational psychologists will talk about the same thing. They call it the task and the relationship. Unless your relationship is settled, equably in the way that everyone's kind of happy with, you can't really get into the task, because actually all you're doing is having this passive aggressive conversation about your relationship. Passive aggression is the big killer of all creativity and all kind of relationship. It's like this acid that eats into everything.
Okay, I'm glad my husband is hearing this conversation. We have a very good question from Gigi Simone. She asks, what about how emotional the topic is, like veganism or abortion versus science or politics? Are there different tactics based on the sensitivity of the question, of the topic?
It's a good question. I mean, the first thing to say here is that my kind of model of good disagreement and good argument is not one in which emotion is removed. And in fact, part of the reason, not the questioner is implying it is, but just as a good chance to talk about this, part of the reason I wanted to write the book was that when I read books or articles about good disagreement, they all seem to aspire to some kind of Socratic ideal where everyone's kind of rational and everyone's calm, and it's like, we can just discuss these, take the emotion out of it, take all that messy stuff out of it. Let's just discuss this like we're in an Oxford seminar. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could do that? I don't think it would be wonderful. I don't want the world to be like that. I don't think it can be like that. We are emotional, messy, creatures, right? And we care about things, and that's a good thing. And furthermore, actually, your emotion makes you better at thinking, right? When you get emotional about, in the right context, your emotion will actually drive your cognition. So I think when you're talking about sensitive topics like veganism, I know, get the emotion out, let the emotion into the conversation. And I think one of the problems is people try and have these conversations unemotionally, and therefore they never really get to the heart of it. The good thing about a good argument or a good row is that it exposes what the other person really cares about and really thinks about. That's one of the benefits of a disagreement and an argument. So if you don't let that out, if you don't have some emotion, I think you're kind of missing out on one of the best parts of it.
Someone else asked a very good question, is what if you're following the rules of good arguments and doing all the things that you suggest in your book, but the person you're arguing with doesn't? Is it still possible to have a productive argument?
I think you have to think about it in two stages. The first stage is, can I get them to engage in a productive argument? And the second stage is, yes or no. You might be able to. If you can't, just end the conversation, right? So I don't want to be nobody should be under the illusion that everybody is open to being engaged in a productive disagreement. However, what I do think is that we underestimate the extent to which we can engage people who at first seem to be impervious to a good conversation. We can bring them round. Right. I think we underestimate to the extent to which that is possible. So when somebody is being hostile or aggressive or irrational, whatever, first of all, just think, ask yourself, what's going on here? Why are they like this? It might be because they are feeling insecure. They might be nervous. They might be scared, and that relationship level is not settled. They might think that you're talking down to them, that you're patronizing them. So just check on all these things and see if there's anything I can do to put them at ease.
Yeah, we're getting some very good questions about how to talk to someone, let's say in America, with whom you have a vast political dispute, and how you talk to anti-vaxxers. And I want to point out another really smart thing you say in your book, which is to become an excellent listener. You say, restate what the other person is saying, point out the parts of his argument that are correct, and also argue with your opponent's strongest view, not his weakest one. Don't fall into the trap of kind of attacking a straw man argument or something that's easy to turn over. And you also say, sorry, this is too many things at once, but let yourself really almost be persuaded to feel the emotional force of the other side's argument.
Yeah. So okay. So the first thing you talked about there is replaying what the other person's point of view is. This is an incredibly powerful skill that actually we very rarely practice. Therapists use it. They sometimes call it reflection. But interrogators use it, and it's very simple. It's just like, as I understand what you're saying, your position on this is, or your opinion is ABC, right? Now, just doing that will force you to think a little bit harder about what the other person is saying. It gives them a chance. First of all, it makes them feel heard, right? It's like, okay, you are trying to listen to me. And it also gives them a chance to come back and say, no, that's not what I mean. I mean, a lot of disagreements are basically misunderstandings. You're actually not understanding me, and I'm not understanding you. So let's clear away all that by saying, okay, is this what you're saying? Yes or no? No, actually, that's not what I'm saying. It's more like this. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. And actually, now you put it like that, actually, I 50% agree with you. So we're closer already. You can't do this again. You can't do this as a kind of trick. It has to be something that you're generally trying to understand what the other person is saying. And yeah, I think the thing about there's always some truth in the other's position. Not always, but usually there is some grain of truth even in a view that you disagree with. Try and work out what it is, and bring it up and acknowledge it, because it's actually quite another way to connect is saying, the thing we do agree on, I think, is this. Am I right? And that's going to make the rest of the conversation go a little bit easier. And yeah, I think understanding the other's position is something that people quite often talk about, but I think people sometimes mean it in a kind of intellectual sense. I need to kind of grasp the philosophical nature of the other's argument. Okay, you should do that, but also there's a feeling behind. I think you need to kind of tune into what the other person is feeling about it too. Doesn't mean that you're going to end up agreeing with them or feeling about things in the same way. You can still disagree with them 180 degrees, but I think you kind of need to tune into what they're feeling, and that's going to help you understand what this conversation is really about.
Mm-hmm. I thought we would very quickly play one other clip. It has to do with QAnon, and it's not really a disagreement, but it's a woman explaining how she was persuaded. That's just a little clip, but this is obviously a really important phenomenon now, and it's very hard to engage someone who's kind of in the depths of that kind of belief in a conversation. What would you suggest in that situation?
That is a tough one, but I think the same thing applies as we were talking about earlier, which is it's probably unwise to go in there and say, okay, well, this is clearly nonsense. Why are you believing this crazy nonsense? The interviewer does it there, but the lady's already kind of converted and come round. I think what you need to do is resist what addiction therapists call the writing reflex, when you try and make someone write. So addiction therapists changed their whole practice about 20 years ago. For a long time, post-war, addiction therapy was, the basic model was you try and break them. You try and break the patient down. So you tell them over and over again, you're ruining your life. This is a real problem for you. You need to stop drinking or taking drugs. You're hurting the people around you, and break their resistance. And after a while, I realized this was not working very well. In fact, it was counterproductive, because when people heard that, it made them want to drink and take drugs even more. Because going back to this thing, nobody likes to be told what to do. Nobody likes to be pushed around. We're innately perverse creatures. And now they're much less likely to do that. So therapists now will just say, you tell me about what's going on in your life, and I'll help you, come to a better way of living, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. You've got to work that out for yourself. So they don't succumb to their writing reflex, right? They're not saying, I'm going to tell you how to live right? I'm not going to put you right. Okay. Now we all have that instinct, right? When we come across somebody who we can see is clearly living in a bad way or has some bad idea, QAnon is the kind of ideas equivalent of somebody with a really bad drug addiction. and your natural instinct is to say, stop taking the drugs, or, you know, stop watching these stupid videos, which are nonsense. It's very powerful, right? I would want to do that as well. But the trouble is, it's just nearly always counterproductive. You're going to get pushback.
Because the person feels threatened in some way. That's their emotional state.
The person feels threatened. The person feels like you're trying to dominate them. Psychologists call this reactants. You're generating reactants in the other person. And when somebody feels like they're being dominated, or there's an attempt to dominate them, they will just react in all sorts of ways. Crazy, you know, emotional, aggressive, hostile, they'll lash out. It's the trigger for all sorts of really difficult behaviors. And so a lot of disagreement, particularly when you're dealing with these extreme positions, is, you know, you're trying to engage them in a conversation where you don't trigger that reactance, and that means not going in kind of full on with a writing reflex and saying this is nonsense.
Simon had a question. Yeah,
I want to ask a question from Henry Druckerman, who says, how do you deal with situations when close friends who you feel very strongly about are worlds apart from you on political issues like Trump, he says, and of course in the UK there's been the same with Brexit. How do you try to separate that friendship from that disagreement?
I think the first thing to say is try not to do it over email or WhatsApp. A lot of these conversations that people are having with old friends, I think particularly in the States where politics is so polarized, go badly because they're happening in a format which is just almost antithetical to kind of rich human conversation and relationships. And, you know, what I was saying right at the beginning of the conversation is that when the disagreement feels like it's just about the disagreement itself, it quickly becomes kind of toxic and hostile. When you're actually face to face with someone, or even when you're talking, you know, over a screen like we are, you're less fast to get into that kind of mode of defensiveness and hostility that leads to that kind of power struggle that we've been talking to. When you're with your friend and you can see them and you can see where they live, or you're having a beer with them, suddenly the richness of the conversation feels the much more important thing. And that means you're both more relaxed about having a discussion about whether or not Trump was a good president or whatever it is. So yeah, I would say, you know, try and have the conversation in person, have it over a beer, but any way you can to remind each other that your human relationship is more important than whatever the political issue of the day.
And another tactic that you bring up in your book, which I think is really smart, is about face and allowing the person to save face in the argument. Can you talk a bit about how that works?
Yeah, so in any kind of public arena or any conversation really, but particularly when there are other people around, we want to put on our best face, right? I want to put on my best face in this conversation. I want to project a certain image of myself in this conversation, and I'm putting in, you know, I'm like a duck paddling underwater. I'm putting in immense effort here, guys, into projecting, you know, somebody who's vaguely kind of competent at what they do. And so we're all doing this, right? We're all putting in some face work, is what the psychologists call it. And when we feel that our face work is going badly, and that we feel nervous about the face that we think maybe I'm going to be embarrassed or humiliated here, it's difficult for us to concentrate on the conversation itself, on that content level, and things can quickly kind of go off the rails. So when you're in a tense conversation or a disagreement, you can do a couple of things. Be kind of, you know, try and be relaxed about a little bit about your own face, about your own face work. But actually, more importantly, is you can put in the face work on the other person's behalf. You can make them feel like they are looking pretty good in this conversation. That's going to relax them. So it's interesting. Like when you talk to hostage negotiators, they'll tell you that they don't pick up the phone and say, right, how are we going to get these guys? How are we going to do this negotiation and get the hostages out or solve this crisis, whatever it is? They pick up the phone and they spend some time saying things like, look, I can see that you are handling this whole situation really well. You've got everything under control. I would just like to say that everyone here on this team is really appreciative of the way you've been handling this. Now that's putting in the face work on the other's behalf, right? They're making that person feel like they look good in this situation, and that relaxes them. And that means they are much more ready to get into a good negotiation, and they're much more open to the conversation that's about to follow. All right, we're not all going to do hostage negotiation, but the same principle apply in any kind of argument. You can put the other person at ease by showing them that actually, yeah, you know, I can see why you think now. I respect what you're saying. Make them feel that changing their mind or backing down or shifting position is actually a little triumph that they've arrived at, right? It's not some victory that you've won. That's the.
And how do you do that? It seems tricky to set that up.
Well, I think you can do that by a sort of series of signals that show them that a lot of the things we've been talking about, basically, you know, show them that you can see where they're right. Like there's something that you show them that you've learned from them. That's something that you said there that was so interesting and actually it's made me think again, you know. And if you don't know what that is, try and find it again. Try, you know, be genuine about it. Try and dig for something until you get to the point where you say, ah, okay, well, that's actually changed my mind about what you've been saying. I think there is just a kind of, and it'll vary from context to context. So if you're in a professional workplace, you know, you might want to say, look, everyone here knows that you are the best at what you do, right? You are really, really good at what you do.
Make it clear that you're not challenging their status.
Exactly. Make sure that you're not challenging their status or the appearance of competence, right? That they want to project, their face, right? So you are clearly really good. You've been doing a great job. Everybody's been saying that. Okay. There's just one thing I want to talk about, which is this. And here's the thing that we disagree about.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that you talk about, a really important topic you talk about in your book is couple relationships, whether it's marriage or people who live together and their dynamics within families. And you found that actually it's really important to have arguments you know, I think we're probably having, given the lockdown situations around the world, we're having an abundance of arguments, maybe too many. But what advice do you glean for couples?
Yeah, it was so fascinating talking to relationship psychologists about how the field of relationship science, whatever we want to call it, has changed over the past sort of 10, 20 years. It used to be a kind of, the orthodoxy in the field was that couples should try and avoid conflict or kind of heated argument, an emotional argument, where they can, right? When you have differences, just talk about them nicely, basically talk it out. Okay, be nice to each other, show each other the you know, you're affectionate to each other. That's the most important thing. Now when they were doing studies where they do these studies where they get people into the lab, they get them to talk about a difficult issue in their relationship, and then they, you know, either get into a row or they don't, and then they follow all these couples over the next sort of year or two. They check in with them at various points and see how things are going. And basically the upshot of this is that the couples who are very nice to each other in these contexts and who talk very calmly about their differences were less likely to be together a couple of years later, less likely to be satisfied in the relationship if they were together, than the ones who were comfortable having it out and having an argument and actually having a bit of a Barney, as we, I don't know, that's a Britishism, but having a proper row. Those were the couples who were more likely to be fulfilled and happy and still together. And the function of the row or the argument in the relationship seems to be, it keeps you up to date on what your partner is really thinking and really feeling. You're learning about them, right? You get to a point where you think, oh, I know what my partner thinks and feels. I can read them like a book. Well, you don't really, because they're changing and you're changing as you go. And when you have an argument, the veil of kind of normality or kind of politeness gets ripped away and say, oh God, I really get it. You really, really care about that, don't you? It sort of flushes out the cobwebs. And so that's why it's so important in kind of keeping couples together. And I think it's a great kind of microcosm for all these other situations that we've been talking about. You know, a couple is just a small group, a small organization.
Yeah. And certainly all the rules that you talked about earlier apply to couples, just using humor and slowing things down and pointing out the things that you have in common. Absolutely. As well. We're getting such great questions. Maybe I'll just ask one more from the audience, which is, what about cultural differences in terms of style of argument or the sort of tolerance for conflict? Is that something you looked at in the book or for your research?
Yeah, a little bit. In a way, the whole thing is about cultural differences, not necessarily kind of national ones, but, you know, every couple or every rock group or every business has its own culture of conversation and disagreement. And a lot of the book is about trying to move that culture towards a positive disagreement. But yeah, so very broadly speaking, Western versus Asian norms tend to be a bit different, tends to be kind of more emphasis, a little bit more emphasis on hierarchy and on kind of stability of relationships in Asian contexts, which does make confrontation and conflict more uncomfortable. People tend to come at it much more obliquely. But even there, things are changing in the direction I've been talking about, which is people are, you know, there are kind of more, they're getting more egalitarian in terms of like who is allowed to speak and who speaks. And so again, they're having to deal with this tension because none of us are kind of used to it. So they're just kind of in a different place from us. But within the West, of course, there are differences as well. So, you know, you guys live in Paris, you will have seen this. The French are, I think, much more comfortable with argument and open disagreement than the British, perhaps. You know, in Britain, we'll say, you know, don't talk about politics or religion at the dinner table. And I was talking to a French person about this, and she said, well, we don't see things like that at all. You know, it's part of the fun of sitting down for lunch.
That you've had an interesting conversation if people have clashed and disagreed. I mean, that is French television at 9 p.m. every night. It's just people clashing with each other happily.
Right. And it's not like, you know, it's not a sign that, you know, we hate each other. We're just sitting around this table, and the fact that we're getting into an argument is the opposite, right? When it goes well, it's like, it's a sign that we do respect each other and love each other enough to get to have this kind of substantive.
That you trust the other person's intelligence enough that they can stand up to your questioning and all that. Okay, we have so many more questions to ask. We didn't get to talk about the internet and what it's like to disagree on Twitter and all that, but it's all, I promise you, in the book, in Ian's wonderful book, which is for sale now. Ian, thank you so much for coming, for being subjected to my interrogations on Pandemonium U.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Thank you, Simon. That was fantastic fun. Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Pandemonium, you will be back in, I think it's 2 weeks, with Catherine Fieschi. Simon, do you just want to say a word about what she's going to talk about?
Yeah, Catherine actually got to know the Le Pens, the founders of the French far right, well. She especially knew Jean-Marie Le Pen, a kind of demonic figure in France. And she's going to talk about the history of the modern French far right and this peculiar family, the Le Pens.
Yeah, talk about having conversations with people you disagree with. I think she probably can address the same topic.
Fascinating.